Okay, let's move on now to the very last topic of this class. As I've said many times, I never procrastinate. I just use Google Image. I started to think explicitly about the topic of self-esteem when I was a senior as an undergraduate here. I started to think about it when I noticed another phenomenon. So that was after I'd switched into philosophy and psychology. I was very happy in my concentration. I was very happy in playing on the squash team. Harvard was going great for me. But then I started to notice something that was unclear, didn't make sense to me. And that was the fact that I had low self-esteem. Or so it seemed at least. And it didn't make sense to me. Because I was doing well, I had won prizes, I'd received a lot of accolades, a lot of support, whether it's from my roommates, friends, family, a lot of pats on the back, in athletics, in academics. And yet I had low self-esteem, and it just didn't make sense to me. And there was another thing that baffled me even more. It was as if, on some level, I was punished by success. What do I mean by that? Every time when I would succeed, or when I did get praise, my self-esteem would increase, would improve. But then, very quickly afterwards, it went down back to its base level, and even lower. And in order to raise it back up again, I needed even more praise, even more accolades than I needed before. And the metaphor that kept on coming to mind was Sisyphus pushing a rock up a mountain. I would push that rock up the mountain, struggle, till the next victory came. And the next victory came, and I got the praise, I got the accolades, I got the prize. And my self-esteem was high. I was on top of the mountain. And then this rock would be rolled down again. And I would have to run down and start pushing it up again, only this time the hill was even steeper. And I would have to struggle even more. And I would get up there again, and then it rolled back down. Now it wasn't enough to have the accolade, the praise, the amount, the quality and the quantity that I had before. I needed even more just to get onto the same mountain, even steeper, even more difficult. And it didn't make sense to me. And then I took a class. Senior year ended up being one of my favorite classes for various reasons which I will not go into now. Fairy tales. I took fairy tales and we read Emile, Rousseau's Emile, and Maria Tatar talked about wonderful theories, and it clicked. I ended up writing my senior my final paper for that class on self-esteem, and that eventually became my dissertation. That's what I actually wrote my PhD on, this topic. So what I want to do today is share with you some of the insights that I got in fairy tales, as well as other thinkers who have been thinking about this topic of self-esteem, because it is important. It is not for nothing that I end the course with the topic of self-esteem, because it is at the foundation, at the core of so many of the other things that we discussed, whether it's healthy relationships, whether it's happiness in general, whether it's benefit finding or benefit creating, whether it's being known rather than validated. Self-esteem encompasses so many of these ideas. So here is what we're going to do. First of all, we're going to talk about why it is important. A lot of misunderstanding about what self-esteem is and is not. We're going to talk about some theories that can apply to our lives. Then we'll elaborate on the paradox that I just talked about, that sometimes success actually leads to lower levels of self-esteem. And why does that happen? We'll explain that. And then I'll introduce essentially my dissertation on self-esteem, where I divided the one construct into three distinct components, which are dependent self-esteem, self-esteem that is generated by others, praise, approval; independent self-esteem, self-esteem that comes from within, self-esteem that is not contingent on what other people say, self-generated; and finally, unconditional self-esteem, or a state of being where we simply and naturally exist. So I'll talk about these three levels and how we can cultivate independent as well as unconditional self-esteem. And finally, we'll end next time by talking about how we can enhance our levels of self-esteem. Now, many people, when they listen to a lecture on self-esteem, go into evaluation mode and say, okay, so do I have high self-esteem? I meaning you. Or is my self-esteem higher than the person sitting next to me, or my partner or friend? And the answer to this question is you can't really know. I mean, we can't measure self-esteem, quote-unquote, objectively. We don't really know where it is in the brain yet. We may be able to 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But that's not an important question. Just like, am I happy or not, is not an important question. In fact, a misleading question. The question, rather, remember, is how can I become happier? The same with self-esteem. The question is not do I have high or low self-esteem, but rather how can I enhance my self-esteem? Because as I'll argue shortly, there cannot be too much self-esteem. But sometimes people associate with too much self-esteem, which is arrogance and conceit and narcissism, is not self-esteem. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's lack thereof. So having a stronger sense of self is a good thing. And the question is, how can I enhance it? Today my self-esteem is higher than it was when I started thinking about it 15 years ago, and hopefully 15 years or 5 years from now it will be higher than it is today. It is a lifelong process, and we'll talk about how that lifelong process unfolds and what we can do to expedite it, to intensify it. So first of all, definition of self-esteem. There are numerous definitions. Let me read you just a few from the main thinkers in the area. So Albert Bandura, Stanford professor, explains gauging self-esteem, quote, in terms of how people evaluate themselves. Those who express the sense of unworthiness are said to have low self-esteem, whereas persons who express self-pride are said to hold themselves in high esteem. Another well-known thinker in the area, Germain, defines self-esteem as the judgment and feelings about the self. Very simply, the judgment and feelings about the self. Cooper Smith, one of the most important thinkers in the area, self-esteem is an evaluation which an individual makes and customarily maintains with regard to himself. It expresses an attitude of approval or disapproval and indicates the extent to which the individual believes himself to be capable, significant, successful, and worthy. Capable, significant, successful, and worthy. In short, self-esteem is a personal judgment of worthiness that is expressed in the attitudes the individual holds toward himself. It's about the attitude that I have toward myself. It's the evaluative part of the self-concept. The definition that I will use, and that I used in my dissertation, and I think that captures best what self-esteem is about, is Nathaniel Branden's. Nathaniel Branden, considered by many to be the father of the self-esteem movement in this country, if not the world, a therapist and a philosopher that has been working in the area for 50 years, defines self-esteem as following: the disposition to experience oneself as competent to cope with the basic challenges of life and as worthy of happiness. Two components: the feeling, the experience of competence, and the feeling and the experience of worthiness. Both are important. If we lack one, we very often have low self-esteem. Personal example, I felt very competent at what I was doing, whether it was on the squash court, whether it was in relationships, whether it was academically. And yet my self-esteem was low. because I didn't have the worthiness component, now I know, of self-esteem. So one or the other are not enough. We need both. Nathaniel Branden continues, of all the judgments we pass in our lives, none is as important as the one we pass on ourselves. Why? Because we're constantly with ourselves. It affects every area of our lives, when we're alone, when we're with others, when we're at work, when we're working by ourselves, when we're in a team. It affects every area of our life. As Goethe said, the greatest evil that can befall man is that he should come to think ill of himself. So high self-esteem is important, or self-esteem, a sense of self, is important. And yet, if we look around us, if we look within us, there is much room for improvement. Some people more than others, but for everyone, there is room for improvement. Here are some of the benefits associated with high self-esteem. First of all, mental health, higher levels of resilience, dealing with difficulties. And this applies to kids who are 6 years old or to 96-year-olds. Throughout our lives, the higher our levels of self-esteem, the more resilient we are, the better we are able to deal with anxiety, with depression, with the inevitable hardships that arise. Relationships improve. This applies very much, as we'll see later, to romantic relationships. It applies as much to friendships. It applies as much to family relationships. In the words of Branden, self-concept is destiny. Beliefs are self-fulfilling prophecy. If I think of myself, believe in myself, believe that I'm worthy, that I'm capable of a lot, I'm much more likely to succeed. Remember the two predictors John Cotter had for highly successful HBS grads. The first one was that they were always asking questions, always wanting to learn more. The second was that they believed in themselves. This is what distinguished the most successful from the rest. Self-concept is destiny. Emotional intelligence, a concept popularized by Daniel Goleman, initially introduced by Salovey from Yale, by Gardner from Harvard. How effective we are with others. Our intrapersonal intelligence, our interpersonal intelligence, together making emotional intelligence much higher for people with high levels of self-esteem. And finally, the sum total happiness. In my research, as well as other people's research, the correlation between self-esteem and happiness is above 0.6. Very high correlation. Not the only determinant, but certainly one of the major determinants of happiness. On the other hand, low self-esteem is associated with anxiety. I'm not talking about the natural kind of anxiety. If I'm standing on a cliff and I feel some anxiety looking down, that's natural, that's healthy. Permission to be human. It's important to experience anxiety. It's natural. We all do it. Just like the law of gravity is part of physical nature, anxiety is part of human nature. But anxiety that is unhealthy is one that is for no apparent reason. Again, Branden calls it self-esteem anxiety. Suddenly waking up in the middle of the night and feeling anxiety for no apparent reason. Or going through life generally with a sense of angst or fear. Not really clear, not really sure of what. That is very often a symptom of low self-esteem. Depression. Again, we're constantly spending time with ourselves. We're constantly inside our minds. The I is constantly evaluating the me. And if the evaluation is wanting, if it's low, very often it leads to depression. Psychosomatic symptoms include insomnia, include getting sick because our immune system is lower, physical immune system is lower, and so on. Self-concept is destiny. It applies to our top performance, it applies to our worst performances as well. School children who are underachievers, very often that's associated or a result of low self-esteem. Nathaniel Branden called self-esteem the immune system of consciousness. the immune system of consciousness. When we have high self-esteem, it means we're more resilient psychologically. Remember, a strong immune system does not mean we don't get sick. It means we get sick, but less often, and when we do get sick, we recover more promptly. The immune system of consciousness. It means that sickness is the exception, well-being is the rule. It means that we're pursuing happiness rather than constantly running away from unhappiness. These are all signs of high self-esteem versus low self-esteem. Resilient psychology. Bednar and Peterson, two researchers in the area, asked the question, what is the underlying cause, or is there an underlying cause to most psychological disorders and ailments? And what they came up was with one construct, and that was self-esteem. Self-esteem is critical, first of all, in understanding many of the emotional and behavioral problems, and second, in terms of treating most, not all, but most of the emotional and behavioral problems. Self-esteem at the core. Finally, it doesn't just apply on the individual level, it also applies on the societal level. There was a California task force by the government that coined self-esteem as a social vaccine, because what they found was that self-esteem was associated, low self-esteem was associated with substance abuse, teen pregnancy, school dropout rates, violence, and crime. And high self-esteem did the opposite, helped overcome these social ailments. Again, not a panacea, but helps in many ways. So self-esteem is good. Self-esteem, in fact, is great. It's important. However, not all is rosy in self-esteem land. And there are some criticisms, and some criticisms by very important thinkers in the area. One of them, the leading one, is Roy Baumeister from Florida, equating self-esteem with arrogance and conceit. Because if you take a questionnaire of narcissism, those who are high on narcissism will also score very high on a self-esteem measure. But here lies the problem. And here in the paper that you're reading is how we can debunk at least this criticism. There are others. You see, a person who is a narcissist, who is arrogant, doesn't have high self-esteem. I mean, we all know that's common sense. Someone who walks into the room immediately looking like a peacock, showing off, bragging, does that person have high self-esteem? Probably not. A person who is humble, who doesn't need to constantly show off, is usually the person with higher levels of self-esteem. As Rollo May, one of the founders of the humanistic psychology movement, says, the person who feels weak becomes a bully, the inferior person a braggart. A flexing of muscles, much talk, cockiness, and endeavor to brazen it out are symptoms of covert anxiety in a person or a group. It's the exact opposite of self-esteem. Unfortunately, today, our measures of self-esteem are through questionnaires. And if you ask a narcissist, do you have high self-esteem? The answer will, of course, be yes. However, most of the questionnaires are not sophisticated enough today to differentiate between true self-esteem and what Nathaniel Brennan calls pseudo-self-esteem, the pretense of self-efficacy and self-respect. Soon, we'll be able to measure that much more objectively. So that's for narcissism, but there are other criticisms, and that is that self-esteem, high self-esteem, leads to unrealistic evaluation, and that ultimately hurts people. Let me read you something from Times Magazine, a report about a certain test that was given to kids, 13-year-olds, in different countries around the world. A standardized math test was given to 13-year-olds in 6 countries last year. Koreans did the best, Americans did the worst, coming behind Spain, Ireland, and Canada. Now the bad news. Besides being shown triangles and equations, the kids were shown the statement, quote, "I'm good at mathematics." unquote. Americans were number one with an impressive 68% in agreement. American students may not know their math, but they have evidently absorbed the lessons of the newly fashionable self-esteem curriculum wherein kids are taught to feel good about themselves. Where kids are taught to feel good about themselves, and I will add, no matter what. Because teachers, many teachers have learned to just give indiscriminate praise. Why? Because self-esteem is good, it's a social vaccine, and there's a lot of research to back that up. And how do you enhance self-esteem? By showering people with, oh, you're terrific, you're wonderful, you're great. But that, it turns out, does not help these students. In fact, in the long run, in the short term, it feels good, but in the long term, it actually reduces their motivation to work. It makes them unrealistic, and in the long run, it makes them less happy than they potentially could have been. In fact, it boomerangs. Again, with good intentions, because they want to raise their self-esteem. So how do we salvage self-esteem? By understanding its true nature. First of all, self-esteem is not a product of empty reinforcement. Oh, you're wonderful, you're terrific, you're great, no matter what. That hurts self-esteem in the long term. Self-esteem has to be distinguished from pseudo-self-esteem. Once again, the pretense of self-efficacy and self-respect without the reality. That's not self-esteem. That's narcissism. That's detachment from reality. And as we've been talking about constantly, psychological health is a function of connection to reality. So what is self-esteem? Self-esteem is founded in reality, in actual performance, in actual success, in actual practices. It is a product of hard work. Okay, do you remember the secret of success from 2 months ago? Optimism, belief in oneself, passion for what one is doing, and finally, hard work. That's the secret. Again, something we all know, something that is commonsensical. But again, common sense, in Voltaire's words, is not that common. Nathaniel Branden talks about 6 practices that are important for the cultivation of self-esteem. First, integrity. That's your response paper this week. To raise levels of awareness about integrity. And integrity means a match between what we say and what we do. The little things and the big things. Whether it's, I'll be there at 5 minutes after 5, being there at 5 minutes after 5. Saying that I'm going to work out this week, and actually doing it. Because you see, when we communicate, when we utter words, and we don't follow up on what we say, what we're essentially communicating to ourselves, what I say is not important. It doesn't matter. Whereas when I maintain high levels of integrity, when I keep my words, and again, no one is perfect, no one has perfect integrity, as we'll talk about next time, but when I generally keep my word, when I follow up on what I say, when I under-promise and over-deliver, that's when I communicate to myself in action. Remember, self-perception theory. In action, I communicate to myself, my words matter, I matter. So the practice of integrity, the practice of self-awareness, know thyself. Self-consciousness, as Branden talks about. Purposefulness, having goals, having self-concordant goals, pursuing them. Living a life of purpose, of calling. Taking responsibility. Remember, once again, no one is coming. It's up to you to make something of your life. The practice of self-acceptance, permission to be human on a daily basis. And finally, the practice of self-assertiveness. To say no when it's appropriate, to say yes when that is appropriate, to stand up for what we believe in. These are the practices that over time cultivate self-esteem. And they're also a product of self-esteem. As we'll see next time, it's a potential self-reinforcing loop. So this is what self-esteem is. But there are more problems. the more problems in self-esteem land. Here is another important criticism. You see, a lot of research shows that people with high self-esteem are more generous and more benevolent toward others. They're generally good. They're nice. A lot of research shows that. So that's wonderful, terrific. However, there is also a lot of research that shows the exact opposite. That people with high self-esteem display antisocial behavior, whether it's toward people they don't know, especially toward people close to them. It's been associated with aggressive and uncooperative behavior. Levels of hostility associated with high self-esteem in some studies. There are contradictory evidence. Doesn't make sense. What's going on in self-esteem land? Hasn't been resolved until recently. Another criticism of self-esteem is what I mentioned, the paradox of self-esteem. You see, the praise that I received as a senior here, or as a student here in general, was praise that was based on reality. You know, I did well in squash, I got praise for that. I did well academically, I got praise for that. So it was real, it was grounded in reality, and yet I still felt like I had low self-esteem. In fact, the more praise I got, in many ways I felt that the rock became heavier and the mountain steeper. And that is not explained by traditional self-esteem research. Bednar and Pedersen talk about this paradox, and they give examples in their book, and this is the first place where I found someone talking about something that I'd experienced for many years. They talk about the paradox where very often success is associated with low levels of self-esteem. So let me read to you an account of a client that they had, they're a therapist, who has been very successful. And here he is writing in his journal. For the past several years, I felt that my life was meaningless. This was an ironic state of affairs, considering all that I'd accomplished. Friends and relatives were always lauding me for my good looks and intelligence. I was the first person on either side of my family to graduate from college, doing so with honors. I had a good job with an important accounting firm. I had plenty of dates. By all outward appearances, my life was very fulfilling. Yet I was miserable and felt increasingly depressed. 6 months of psychotherapy had helped me to catch an occasional glimpse of the underlying cause of my unhappiness. It always seemed to involve low self-esteem or my disapproval of myself. Somehow it seemed like I really did have a low opinion of myself, but I found that idea confusing because of all the success in my life. Bednar and Pedersen talk about or introduce there the paradox of self-esteem. That's what they call it. Self-esteem is not associated with success. It's not associated with social status, with money. It's associated with other elements. In fact, as the paradox shows, very often more success leads to more difficulty in this realm. It was this difficulty that I wanted to explore and explored in my research.